Okay, this time I want to talk about, well, tea and coffee. Um, Particularly tea, as these days it's very much the drinking of tea is a part of English culture. Um, I've mentioned before tea how at Dad's mum's house she would um, put the kettle on at very low gas, and when it boiled, you'd have a cup of tea, which would be every hour or so. Um, it's a gesture more than anything of that you welcome, because it takes time to make a cup of tea. But if you do it properly, it does. Um, but I was incensed by a pathetic article in the Guardian where the writer mocks and insults both tea uh, and English people, and in particular what he calls nanas. It means grandmas, I suppose. But he talks in a way as though he's referring to any old um, English woman, and if you visit them, you you're offered a cup of tea and biscuits, and he thinks this is a terrible thing because tea is such an awful thing. He even, I'm talking about Joel Golby, by the way, an article in the Guardian about 10 days ago, something like that. Um, he he even insults the idea that um, the fact that tea is offered when you've had some sort of trauma or bad experience. Well, have a cup of tea, as though this is a bad thing. I don't even the not just the tea itself as being the wrong thing to offer, but the very idea that English culture is someone's had a bad experience, effectively sit down and I'll listen to you. I say this in defence of my own grandmother. I say this very much in defence of my other grandmother, who, while she would offer tea in the normal course of events, made a big ritual of coffee of a Sunday morning, percolated coffee. I have a percolator here. Um, it's sort of, this isn't quite the same because this one it has a place to put the ground coffee. There wasn't such a thing as instant coffee when I was a child, or at least it wasn't available, normally speaking, in England anyway. But the one she had a tube in the bottom here that came up and dropped the boiling water in there. So you put this on the gas. The water got hot. As it got hot, the steam come up from the bottom because it had a little plate in the bottom with small holes in it, and it pushed its way up the tube in the middle, and the boiled water come out into the top. This is a slightly different method, but the principle is very similar. It's the ritual, it's the welcome that's part of the English tradition. It's the same kind of tradition, the same idea that you'll see in Ireland in particular with Guinness. That it takes time. You know when you're part of the community because you know that you have to wait for it to settle, and then the barman will top it up to the top, and you still leave it a bit before you drink it. It's the culture that there's a real meaning in these things. It is a connection with, if you like, a sort of, you might just call it on a simple level, friendliness, concern, empathy, or it's a connection. It can be described, I suppose, but almost as a spiritual connection, if you were in that, if you believe in that sort of thing at all. It's caring for people on put in a simple level, and the fact that English people will care for people, he finds offensive. He has a go at tea, that tea is awful, but he says it's clear that it's not really the tea is using that as an excuse for the problem. He wants to have a go at caring people, and older people who, generally speaking, are caring. They are the ones that listen. I want to say this also in defence of my mother-in-law, who I've never met because she died before before I was married to her daughter. But the whole of our family, when speaking about her, the memory is of what a nice person she was. And I distilled it down that the key trait, amongst no doubt many others, was that if you had a problem, her reaction was to sit down, have a cup of tea and a fag where that was relevant. Now, cigarettes might not be good for you in themselves, but they were until, I don't know, there's a particular date when it seemed to happen. I think it's probably in the 80s. They were shared. It was offered amongst smokers, men mostly, but not only men. Again, as a gesture of common concern. In fact, if you have to remember that smoking wasn't considered to be a bad or even an unhealthy thing. If you go right back into the 1950s, it was not generally realised that it was bad for your health. Hard to conceive now. But there are pluses and minuses even to cigarettes. But the point I'm making here is not about that so much as the mother-in-law would say, sit down and I'll listen. Unlike a lot of people, myself included, I suppose, that there's a greater tendency to say, oh, well, you should do this, you should do that. Now, she may have also mentioned things like that, but the key trait that people loved and remember her for is that she would listen over a cup of tea and or a fag. My grandmother, my mother's mother, would listen over a cup of tea. She would call you in for the week's news, where I would talk with her and particularly Uncle Ken, over the making of the coffee. I didn't even drink the coffee as a child, of course. It wasn't offered to me because children didn't drink coffee. It was a special once a week ritual. It was a ritual. It was part of my family upbringing, and no doubt many other people's, that, well, in our case, tea was normal, routine, absolutely standard ritual for kindness, caring and friendliness. And coffee was a special let's get together, a call to a family gathering. It wasn't alcohol or drink or wine. Yes, people drank ale, but that's when the men would go out and commune, particularly. It wasn't a grandma thing as a general thing. It wasn't a normal, ordinary people family get together. Ale drinking was something more specific. It was after it was a meeting of the men, and when you were first invited in children couldn't go into the pub in the 50s, not until you were 14. And to be invited was a privilege. That's a different thing, though a similar thing in some ways, to tea. Tea is the drink of the English, and how a newspaper can publish an attack on it with immunity, I don't know. I actually sent a complaint to see what would happen, and they haven't even bothered to reply. So I thought, well, I'll see whatever's replaced the Press Complaints Council. It's 4 letters. I can't remember now. It doesn't matter. But the Guardian isn't a member, therefore it doesn't apply to them. So there is no recourse other than actual legal challenge. There's nothing you can sort of say, here, this is a bit over the top. That upsets me as well. I'm not against actually his right to say it, so long as other people have the right to say the same thing about other cultures, which they don't. But why would he be commissioned specifically because he says things like that? I mean, we're under enough pressure from this, that, and the other, our culture. We don't need a deliberate and concerted and ridiculous attack on kindness, which is really what it is. Sympathy. It's disgusting. So I wanted to make my point. So that I'll say bye.